Rain hammered the window of the roadside diner off Route 9, streaking the glass in silver lines that blurred the parked semis outside into ghostly shapes. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and bacon grease, and the hum of an old jukebox fought against the storm outside. Jake Coldwell sat in a corner booth, still in his work jacket, his eyes soft as he watched his 12-year-old daughter Emma sketch in her notebook across from him. She was drawing the truck stop, the rain, the neon sign flickering outside, capturing a world she'd learned to see through careful, watchful eyes, the same way she'd learned to watch her father's face for signs of trouble. Jake wasn't just any trucker. To the world, he was quiet, gray-bearded, a man who hauled freight from state to state and tucked his daughter into a bunk behind the driver's seat more nights than not. But there was a stillness to him, a way he sat with his back to the wall and his eyes tracking every exit, that spoke of a life most people in that diner could never imagine. 3 years ago, Jake had been someone else entirely. A name spoken only in classified briefings, the commander of an elite Navy SEAL team that operated in the shadows where the cameras never reached. He'd buried that man the day his wife died, the day he realized Emma needed a father who came home every night, not a ghost who might not come home at all. So he traded the teams for a rig, the weapons for a steering wheel, and told no one. Not the other drivers. Not the men behind the counter. Not even Emma, who only knew her father as steady, quiet, and impossibly strong in ways she couldn't name. That peace shattered the moment the diner door slammed open. A gust of wind and rain rushed in behind Derek Vance, a mountain of a man with sleeve tattoos crawling up both arms and a black duffel bag slung over one shoulder like a coffin he carried out of habit. Derek was undefeated, 17 wins, no losses, a name whispered with respect and fear in the underground fight circuits that ran through half the trucking routes in the state. He didn't walk into rooms. He claimed them, and tonight, exhausted from a fight 2 towns over and buzzing with the kind of restless aggression that never fully burned off, he was looking for something to prove. His eyes swept the diner and landed on Jake, calm, unbothered, sitting with a child like the storm outside meant nothing to him. Something about that stillness needled at Derek. He'd spent his whole life reading rooms, sizing up threats, and this gray-haired trucker read as nothing. No fear, no tension, nothing to dominate. That absence of fear felt like an insult. Derek crossed the diner floor, boots striking linoleum hard enough that conversations died around him, and dropped his bag beside Jake's table with a heavy thud that rattled the coffee cups. "Heard truckers like you think they're tough," Derek said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, loud enough that heads turned from booths and stools alike. "Let's see if that's true." Emma's pencil stopped moving. She looked up at her father, and for the first time in a long time Jake saw real fear flicker across her face. Not fear of Derek, but fear of what might happen next, fear of losing the fragile normal life they'd built together. Jake didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand. He simply looked up at Derek with the same calm he'd worn during firefights in places whose names never made the news and said quietly, "Not in front of my daughter." Derek laughed, a short ugly sound, and leaned in closer, close enough that the whole diner held its breath. "Running away in front of your daughter?" he sneered, loud enough to draw laughter from a couple of truckers who didn't know any better, who saw only an old man and a bully and assumed they knew how this would end. The words landed like a slap, not because Jake feared them, but because they threatened to drag the very thing he protected for 3 years directly into the open. Emma's hand found his sleeve under the table, gripping tight, and that single touch told Jake everything, that whatever pride he could swallow, whatever insult he could absorb, he would take it, because nothing mattered more than making sure his daughter never saw what he used to be. But the diner had gone silent in that particular way rooms go silent right before something irreversible happens, and Derek, high on adrenaline and ego, mistook Jake's restraint for weakness. He reached down and grabbed the collar of Jake's jacket, hauling him half out of the booth, and in that instant something in Jake's eyes changed. Not anger, not yet, but a recalibration, the quiet mental shift of a man who has spent his life assessing threats and has just concluded that de-escalation has run its course. Emma gasped. The old men at the counter set down their coffee mugs. Outside, the truck driver Jake had waved at earlier lowered his window to see what the shouting was about. And Derek Vance, undefeated 17-0, had no idea that the exhausted-looking trucker whose collar he'd just grabbed had once led men into buildings where every room held someone trying to kill them, had once made split-second decisions that meant the difference between his team coming home and not, had once been a ghost so effective the government still wouldn't confirm his old call sign existed. Derek thought he'd found an easy target for a Friday night ego trip. He was about to discover he'd challenged something the fight circuit had never produced and never could, a father who had already survived the worst the world could offer, holding back not out of fear, but out of love, and who was now, for the first time in 3 years, being given no choice but to let a piece of that old self resurface. If you can already feel the tension crackling in this diner, hit subscribe now, because Chapter 2 is where Jake Coldwell stops being a trucker and starts being exactly who Derek Vance never should have provoked. Derek's grip tightened on Jake's collar, twisting the fabric hard enough to pull him fully out of the booth, and for one suspended second the entire diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how far this would go. Jake's hand came up, not in a punch, not in a wild swing, but in a controlled motion so precise it looked almost gentle, catching Derek's wrist and rotating it just enough to break the grip without breaking the bone. It happened in less than a second, quiet and clean, the kind of movement that only comes from thousands of hours of training in rooms where mistakes cost lives. Derek staggered back half a step, more startled than hurt, his brain scrambling to process what had just happened to a grip he'd used to intimidate dozens of men before. The diner had gone utterly silent except for the rain drumming against the windows and the low hum of the neon sign outside. Emma sat frozen, her sketchbook forgotten, watching her father with wide eyes as something ancient and unfamiliar moved beneath his calm exterior. Not violence, not yet, but readiness, the coiled stillness of a predator who has decided the threat is real. Jake rose slowly to his full height, and though he'd looked unremarkable moments before, something about the way he now carried himself made the air in the room feel different, heavier, charged with a warning only a few people in that diner were experienced enough to recognize. One of them was the trucker who had glanced in from outside, an older man named Frank who'd hauled freight for 30 years and had, in a different life, served 2 tours overseas. He took one look at Jake's stance, weight balanced, shoulders squared, eyes doing that slow methodical sweep of exits and obstacles, and quietly murmured to the man beside him, "That's not a trucker's stance. That's a soldier's." Derek, still riding the adrenaline of having his wrist turned against him, didn't hear the warning. Pride wounded, he swung wide. A heavy right hook meant to end the confrontation in one blow. The same punch that had ended 17 fights before this one. But Jake wasn't there when the fist arrived. He'd shifted half a step to the side, an economy of motion so minimal it looked like he'd barely moved at all, and Derek's fist sailed past him into empty air, throwing the bigger man off balance. Jake's response was equally restrained, a single open palm strike to the center of Derek's chest, not aimed to injure, but to redirect, sending Derek stumbling back into an empty table with a crash of scattering napkin holders and salt shakers. Gasps rippled through the diner. Emma's hands flew to her mouth, torn between terror and something else, something that looked almost like recognition, as if some deep instinct told her this was not the moment to be afraid of her father, but for someone else to be. Derek pushed himself upright, humiliation burning hotter than any bruise, and charged again, this time with the reckless fury of a man who has never lost and cannot process the possibility that he might. Jake met him with the same economy, the same terrifying calm, deflecting a knee strike, controlling an arm, using Derek's own momentum against him until the undefeated fighter found himself face down against the diner floor. One arm locked at an angle that promised real damage with the slightest additional pressure. The room was dead silent except for Derek's ragged breathing and the rain outside. Jake leaned down, his voice low enough that only Derek could hear it clearly, though the words would be repeated by half the diner for years afterward. "I didn't want this. My daughter is right there. But you didn't give me a choice." He released the hold and stepped back, allowing Derek to pull himself up, bloodied only in pride, staring at Jake with something between rage and dawning, uncomfortable respect. It was Frank, the old trucker-turned-soldier, who finally broke the silence, standing up from his stool and saying quietly but clearly, "Son, you just picked a fight with a Navy SEAL." The words landed on the room like a thunderclap. Heads turned. Someone's coffee cup froze halfway to their lips. Derek's face went through disbelief, then something closer to fear as he looked at Jake. Really looked at him. The calluses on his hands, the old scar along his jaw, the way his eyes had never once shown panic even when grabbed and shouted at in front of his own child. Jake didn't confirm it. He never would, not directly, not to strangers in a diner. But he didn't need to. Emma, watching everything, felt something shift inside her too. Not fear of her father, but a flood of understanding about the quiet strength she'd always sensed in him without ever having words for it. Jake knelt down to her booth, gently wiping a fallen strand of hair from her face, his voice returning instantly to the soft, steady tone she knew as simply Dad. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked, and she nodded, managing a small, proud smile despite the tears gathering in her eyes. Around them, the diner slowly exhaled, conversations resuming in hushed, awed tones, several patrons quietly picking up spilled mugs and righting overturned chairs as if trying to restore some sense of normalcy to a night that had just cracked open a legend hiding in plain sight. Derek Vance, humbled for the first time in his career, gathered his duffel bag without another word and walked out into the storm, the undefeated record intact only on paper, because everyone in that diner knew the truth now, that he had lost decisively to a man who never wanted to fight at all. Jake sat back down across from Emma, wrapped his hand gently over hers, and the two of them returned to something resembling peace, father and daughter, alone together against a world that had just glimpsed, for a few tense minutes, exactly what kind of man had been quietly protecting her all along. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this one, ordinary heroes hiding extraordinary pasts, are exactly what this channel is built on, and you will not want to miss what comes next.